You're coming with me.
I'm not going anywhere.
Oh my God.
Step aside, please.
I have every right to be here.
The fluorescent lights in the diner hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow on chipped linoleum floors. Judge Camille Harris slipped into a corner booth, her leather briefcase set neatly beside her. To anyone else, she looked like just another weary traveler seeking coffee after a long day. The black robe folded carefully in her bag remained unseen. A uniformed officer strutted in, boots loud against tile. He noticed her immediately, his gaze sharp, dismissive, already assessing. He smirked. Move along, sweetheart. These seats are for paying customers. Camille's hand tightened around the coffee mug she had just ordered. The steam fogged her glasses. She met his stare. Calm but unyielding. I've already paid, she replied, voice steady. The officer leaned closer, his shadow cutting across her table. His badge gleamed, his smirk widened. You people are always trying to bend the rules, he whispered, low enough for only her to hear. The words slid like a blade under her skin. Conversations in the diner faltered, then resumed, quieter, avoiding. Camille felt the weight of every eye that pretended not to see. Her pulse pounded, but she did not look away. The officer's laugh was sharp, derisive, echoing too loud in the small space. He tapped the table with his baton, deliberate, careful. Lady, one word, and I can make you disappear tonight. Her breath caught. For a flicker of a second, she considered telling him exactly who she was, but stopped. Timing mattered. Witnesses mattered. Power revealed too soon could be wasted. She set her mug down, porcelain clinking like a gavel against wood. The officer straightened, satisfied, already turning his head toward the door. Then the dispatcher's radio crackled on his belt. Urgent requests from the federal courthouse, and he froze. The neon sign outside the roadside diner buzzed, one flickering tube casting a faint pink glow against the midnight asphalt. Inside, the air smelled of grease, old coffee, and weariness. It was the kind of place where truckers came to vanish into their plates, and no one asked questions. Camille Harris walked in with deliberate steps, heels clicking softly. She wasn't in her robe now, only a dark suit, but she carried herself with the posture of someone used to command. Still, she wanted no attention. She only wanted coffee. A booth near the corner, away from the hum of the jukebox, seemed perfect. The waitress, a woman with tired eyes and a pencil behind her ear, slid a laminated menu onto the table. Just coffee, Camille said, her voice measured. The waitress nodded, poured from a steaming pot, and left without a smile. Camille wrapped her hands around the mug. The ceramic was warm, grounding. Her briefcase rested against the booth seat, heavy with files from a day that had stretched far too long. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself the illusion of being invisible. Then the door banged open. Boots hit tile with heavy, deliberate strikes. A uniformed officer stepped inside, scanning the room with the lazy arrogance of someone who believed the world belonged to him. His eyes found her in an instant. He smirked. Seats taken. Camille looked up, meeting his stare with calm precision. I'm already here. The smirk grew sharper. He strolled toward her booth, one hand brushing the baton at his hip. A few heads lifted, then quickly bent back down. The waitress froze halfway through pouring a refill for another customer, then set the pot down without a word. Not for long, the officer said. Camille raised the cup to her lips, unshaken. I've paid for my coffee. His laugh was low, humorless. Paid, huh? That's funny. You people always think dropping a few bills means you own the place. The words cut deep, but Camille's face betrayed nothing. She set the mug down, porcelain clinking faintly against. For me, I am a paying customer, same as anyone else. Not the same, he said, leaning closer, his shadow stretching across her table. Don't get it twisted. The man at the bar shuffled his newspaper, eyes darting, but he didn't intervene. Two teenagers in the far booth whispered nervously, then hushed when the officer's gaze flicked toward them. The silence of the diner thickened, complicit and suffocating. Camille steadied her breathing. Her instinct screamed to reveal who she was, to stop this charade with a single sentence, but years on the bench had taught her timing. Words only mattered if they landed in the right place. With witnesses who could not look away, the officer tapped his baton against her table, rhythmic, threatening. Careful, lady, folks disappear for less around here. Camille tilted her head, eyes unwavering. Is this how you serve the public? By threatening women in diners? His breath reeked of tobacco as he leaned down, his lips nearly brushing her ear. By reminding them of their place, the baton tapped again. Tap, tap. The sound was sharp, like a gavel falling, but twisted. Mocking, the waitress tried to clear her throat, a small attempt at disruption. She's fine here, officer. She paid. I rang her up myself. He shot her a look that silenced her instantly. Stay out of this, Nancy. Camille caught the woman's eyes for the briefest second. There it was, fear, apology, helplessness, the same cocktail she'd seen in witnesses on the stand. People silenced by power before they ever opened their mouths. The officer straightened, turning just enough so the whole diner could see his authority stamped across his badge. Stand up, he ordered. Camille didn't move. No. His jaw ticked. I said, no. Her voice cut like tempered steel, loud enough that every head in the diner jerked upward. You will not order me out of a seat I paid for. For the first time, hesitation flickered across his face, just a flicker. He recovered quickly, lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. You got a mouth on you, sweetheart. That'll get you in trouble. A man in a trucker cap muttered under his breath at the counter. Don't poke the bear, lady. His tone wasn't protective. It was warning. Resignation. Camille turned her gaze on the officer again. Calm, cold. Her pulse thundered in her ears, but she didn't blink. The law protects citizens from harassment, even from officers. He laughed, loud and sharp. The sound echoed across linoleum and chrome, forcing everyone in the diner to hear it. You think the law protects you? Out here, the words stung, not because they were new, but because they were old. Older than him, older than her. They were echoes she had heard in 1,000 different forms, whispered in boardrooms, murmured in courthouse hallways, sneered in parking lots. And then the sudden crackle of his radio. The voice of a dispatcher spilled out, tinny and urgent. All units, be advised. Urgent message from the federal courthouse. Judge Camille Harris is requested immediately. The name hung in the air like a THUNDERCLAP. The officer froze, eyes widening, the baton slipping slightly in his grip. He glanced down at his radio, then back at her. Camille lifted her coffee mug slowly, deliberately, and took a sip. The diner was silent, waiting. She set the cup down with a click, like a gavel on polished wood. Her eyes met his, calm, unshaken. And in that moment, the smirk that had clung to his face all evening disappeared. The diner was still buzzing the next morning, not with neon lights this time, but with whispers. News in a small town didn't travel it. By sunrise, the officer's late-night encounter with a black woman had already twisted through gas stations, barbershops, and church pews. Inside Bill's Hardware, 2 old men leaned against the counter, voices low but pointed. You hear about Carlson last night? One asked. The other chuckled. He said he put some mouthy woman in her place. Typical Carlson, never did know when to quit. Word is, she didn't back down. The chuckle hardened. Yeah, but she will. They always do. Carlson makes sure of it. A younger clerk stocking shelves nearby pretended not to listen. His hands moved faster, nervous. He had heard the name spoken on the radio, Judge Camille Harris. He knew it meant something. But in this town, knowing and speaking were 2 different things. At the police station, Officer Carlson leaned back in his chair, boots propped arrogantly on the desk. His fellow officers gathered around, half amused, half uneasy. You should have seen her face, Carlson said, laughing. Thought she was untouchable. Just another one thinking rules don't apply. A rookie officer frowned. But, didn't dispatch say her name? Camille Harris, isn't she? Carlson waved a hand. Coincidence. Probably some clerk or secretary. Don't read too much into it. Sergeant Miller, older, grizzled, didn't laugh. Careful, Carlson. That name's familiar. Federal. Familia. Carlson's grin faltered for half a second, then returned, wider, forced. Federal, state, county, don't matter. Out here, badge beats a name. Always has. The room quieted. No one argued. Across town, in her hotel room, Camille sat at a small desk with papers spread neatly in front of her. She wasn't reading. The words blurred on the page. She replayed the officer's sneer in her mind. You people always think you can buy your way into places you don't belong. The echo clung. She had heard it before, in law school lectures, whispered just outside earshot. In courtroom hallways, in coded evaluations from peers, but hearing it openly, in public, with bystanders swallowing their voices around her, it gnawed deeper. Her phone buzzed. She answered. Camille. The voice belonged to her clerk, David. Words getting around. How fast? faster than usual. Carlson's bragging. He's telling everyone he shut down a loud black woman at the diner. He doesn't know. Camille's voice was level, controlled. Good. Let him not know. David hesitated. Shouldn't you know? She cut in. If I reveal myself too soon, it looks like personal vengeance. He'll cry, harassment, turn himself into the victim. Timing matters. A pause. Then his voice softened. So you'll wait. I'll watch, Camille said, eyes narrowing, and I'll remember who stayed silent. Later that day, Carlson strutted into the diner again, this time with 2 deputies trailing him. He slapped coins onto the counter and ordered pie. Busy night, huh? One deputy asked. Carlson smirked. Words out. Everybody knows not to cross me. That woman learned quick. A man from the back booth finally spoke, his voice trembling but clear enough to carry. Didn't look like she was the one backing down. Fork clattered against plate. Carlson turned, his smile gone. You got something to say, Tom. The man shrank into the booth, his wife tugging at his sleeve. No, just talkin'. Carlson stared a beat too long, then turned back to his pie, laughing again. That's what I thought. The laughter spread around the diner, nervous and hollow. Whispers resumed as soon as he left. That evening, in a church basement, where community members gathered for a town meeting, whispers thickened into cautious voices. She's not from here. A woman murmured. Doesn't matter. Another replied. Carlson went too far this time. Too far. An older man scoffed. He keeps order. Folks like her don't understand small-town ways. The room divided, some speaking of shame, others of loyalty to the badge. Nobody mentioned her title. Nobody dared. Camille stood just outside the basement door, unseen, listening. She caught every word. Her hand clenched around the strap of her briefcase. She could feel the weight of her robe inside, heavy, waiting. She wanted to march in, slam the gavel, and shatter their excuses, but she stayed still, shadows her only witness. Because this was the truth she needed laid bare. When power flexed, who whispered, who watched, who spoke and who swallowed their tongues. Back at the police station, Carlson leaned against his cruiser, boasting into his phone. She thought she could talk down to me. I showed her quick who runs this town. From his office window, Sergeant Miller watched. He muttered under his breath, You're digging your own grave, Carlson. But he didn't intervene. He closed the blinds instead. In her hotel room, Camille finally spoke aloud to herself, words sharp as glass in the quiet. He laughs now, but laughter has a way of echoing in court. She closed her files, slid the robe from her briefcase, and draped it across the back of the chair. Black fabric, silent authority, waiting. The whispers outside thickened. Carlson's arrogance swelled, and Camille Harris prepared. The hotel room's clock ticked past midnight, its red digits casting a faint glow. Camille Harris sat at the desk, robe draped across the chair like a silent sentinel. Sleep evaded her. The words of Officer Carlson looped in her mind. You people always think you can buy your way into places you don't belong. Her phone buzzed again. David, her law clerk, insisted on calling. She answered this time. Camille, you awake? I am, she said softly. You need rest. Tomorrow's docket is heavy. David, she interrupted. Do you remember the first time you saw me in the robe? A pause. Then, yes, my first day. You walked into chambers, silent, and everyone stopped moving. She smiled faintly. Do you know why? Because you carry it differently. Her eyes closed, memories opened. Flashback, law school, years ago. The lecture hall smelled of chalk and ink. Camille, younger then, sat in the front row. The professor, gray-haired and sharp-tongued, scanned the room. Case precedent on Plessy v. Ferguson. He barked. Camille raised her hand. The precedent was poisoned. Separate was never equal. A few students snickered. A white student leaned over, stage whispering, Ambitious, aren't you? Maybe you should focus on passing before rewriting history. Camille didn't flinch. History needs rewriting, or it repeats. The professor's eyes narrowed. Careful, Miss Harris. Passion doesn't win cases. Facts do. She remembered gripping her pen tighter, whispering to herself, Then I'll turn passion into fact. David's voice pulled her back. You carried that same fire to the bench. Camille stood, pacing the narrow hotel carpet. Fire doesn't vanish, David. It only hardens. Flashback. First year as judge, the courtroom was packed. Camille sat elevated, black robe heavy on her shoulders. A defense attorney smirked up at her, voice oily. Your Honor, perhaps this case is too complex for new perspectives. His eyes lingered too long on her skin. Gasps echoed faintly, but no one challenged him. Camille's gavel struck once, sharp. Counselor, this court recognizes arguments, not insinuations. Proceed to the facts, or be held in contempt. The attorney's smirk faltered. The courtroom leaned forward. She remembered the silence afterward. Not respect, not yet, but something else. Something closer to reckoning. David spoke again. You've faced worse than Carlson. Yes, Camille admitted. But Carlson isn't the threat. He's the echo. The echo. She stopped pacing. The system hides behind men like him. Brash, obvious, expendable. But behind him are the quiet ones. The ones who close blinds, who stay silent, who whisper instead of act. David hesitated. You mean Sergeant Miller? Her silence was answer enough. Flashback. Chambers. 5 years ago she had been passed over for an appellate nomination. The official letter cited regional considerations. Offer court whispers said otherwise. To direct, too black, too female. Her mentor, Judge Whitaker, had leaned across the desk. Camille, he'd said quietly, they'll never admit it, but they measure you against their comfort, not your merit. And if I refuse to shrink, she had asked. He had smiled, tired but proud. Then you'll make them uncomfortable enough to remember you. Camille opened her eyes to the present. The robe still draped across the chair seemed to pulse with memory, as though stitched with every battle fought inside it. David's voice lowered. Carlson thinks last night was victory. Let him. You're not afraid. Her answer was immediate. Fear is constant. It's silence that kills. Flashback. Childhood. Church basement. Her grandmother's voice filled the small Sunday classroom. Child, you don't bow to disrespect. You stand taller. But what if standing makes them angry? Young Camille had asked. Her grandmother's eyes had glistened. Then let their anger prove their weakness. Camille touched the robe's sleeve. Fabric smooth under her fingertips. Her reflection in the hotel mirror stared, back tired but unbroken. David broke the silence. So, what happens now? Camille's voice was steel. Now we wait for Carlson to walk into the one place he cannot twist the truth. A courtroom. David exhaled, relieved. And when he does, she turned, eyes fixed on the robe. He'll learn what belonging looks like. The clock ticked louder, and Camille Harris, judge of the federal court, sat down, resolved. The past had forged her. The robe would carry her forward. The courthouse smelled faintly of paper and varnish, a mixture of bureaucracy and history baked into its wooden benches and stone corridors. Morning sunlight filtered through the high windows, slicing the interior into columns of gold and shadow. Reporters swarmed the steps outside, their cameras cocked like rifles, waiting for the day's confrontation to unfold. By the time the flight attendant arrived, escorted by her union representatives, the administrator was already inside, seated with his counsel and a cluster of FAA officials in dark suits. The air was charged with an anticipation that felt less like due process and more like a prize fight. The case itself was straightforward on the docket. A federal employee appealing an administrative suspension, but beneath the legal language simmered questions of hierarchy, respect, gender, and authority. The slap-raw physical, impossible to minimize, was the spark. The suspension that followed was the institutional response. And yet, standing in that courtroom, everyone sensed that what was about to be argued was bigger. The right of a worker to resist humiliation versus the right of a federal authority to command respect. The judge, an austere figure with sharp lines carved into his face, called the session to order. His gavel's thud silenced the murmurs instantly. The administrator sat upright, polished and disciplined, his suit tailored with military precision. The flight attendant, by contrast, carried herself with a tense mixture of defiance and exhaustion. Her uniform neatly pressed, her hair pulled back, but her jaw clenched tight enough to suggest she'd been rehearsing this fight in her mind for weeks. The first exchange came swiftly. Her attorney rose, voiced steady but edged with indignation, and began laying out the narrative. A respected worker pushed past her breaking point by an authority figure, who weaponized his position to belittle her in public view. He cited witness statements from fellow crew members, described the administrator's allegedly dismissive tone, and emphasized the imbalance of power in the encounter. His strategy was simple: portray the slap not as violence, but as an act of desperation in the face of systemic abuse. The administrator's counsel countered with crisp efficiency. The slap, they argued, was not symbolic resistance but an undeniable breach of professional conduct. The FAA could not afford leniency when the sanctity of order and respect was violated so openly. If federal administrators can be struck without consequence, the lawyer said, his voice echoing in the room, then what message does this send about authority, structure, and discipline? He produced video stills from airport cameras, grainy, but clear enough to show the impact. The confrontation became layered, moving beyond the single incident into questions of culture and precedent. The flight attendant's side introduced union grievances filed months prior, detailing chronic understaffing, overwork, and dismissive treatment by management. The courtroom shifted as murmurs ran through the audience. This was not merely about one slap, but the backlog of frustration it symbolized. When the administrator took the stand, his composure was unnerving. He spoke in clipped sentences, framed the incident as regrettable but unprovoked, and emphasized his decades of service without blemish. His words radiated authority. He was not pleading innocence. He was asserting inevitability. He framed himself as the defender of order against emotional volatility. The flight attendant's testimony cracked the room open. Her voice trembled at first, but steadied as she described the moment. His words cutting into her professionalism, her humanity, her sense of worth. She spoke of working double shifts, of keeping order in turbulence while feeling invisible to those above her. And then she described the slap, how it was not premeditated, not calculated, but something that erupted from a place of exhaustion and humiliation. Silence followed. Even the administrator, expression carved in stone, allowed his eyes to flicker with something unreadable. Outside the courthouse, the battle played out in real time. Protesters gathered with placards, "Protect workers, not power," clashed with signs that read "No excuse for violence." News channels broadcast split screens, one framing her as a working-class hero standing up against arrogance, the other portraying her as reckless and dangerous in a role that demanded composure. Inside, the legal back-and-forth intensified. Expert witnesses were called: aviation psychologists, labor historians, even a former administrator who testified that respect between staff and authority must be a two-way street. Each testimony built tension, layering complexity onto what might otherwise have been a simple disciplinary appeal. The union's closing argument thundered: if the FAA cannot protect the dignity of its workers, how can it claim to ensure safety in the skies? The administrator's lawyer countered with surgical calm: if the system tolerates physical aggression, discipline itself collapses. By the time the judge recessed, the air was thick with sweat, anticipation, and the low hum of speculation. The courthouse steps became a stage for competing press conferences. The flight attendant's attorney framed the day as a triumph of truth over intimidation. The administrator emerged later, flanked by officials, dismissing the proceedings as noise distracting from the FAA's real mission. His words struck with calculated resonance, but his eyes betrayed the cost of the battle. Inside that courthouse, the confrontation had become more than testimony. It was a referendum on how far authority could lean before it broke the human beings who served beneath it. Both sides left claiming dignity, yet both bore wounds invisible but undeniable. The crowd dispersed, the courthouse emptied, but the narrative was no longer contained within those walls. It would spill into living rooms, news cycles, and union halls, reshaping how the public understood not just this slap, but the power structures embedded in every workplace. The courthouse was silent again by nightfall, its windows dark, but the confrontation it housed refused to settle. It lingered in the national consciousness like a bruise, tender, visible, and waiting for judgment. The courthouse confrontation had barely ended before the storm broke loose. By dawn the next morning, the incident was no longer a disciplinary appeal buried in bureaucratic files. It was front-page news, top trending hashtags, and the lead segment on every major network. The clip, the slap, slowed down frame by frame, his head snapping sideways, her hand frozen midair and on a loop. Some anchors called it shocking, others called it courageous. Commentators lined up on split screens, their voices rising, their interpretations widening the divide. At a small diner across town, the flight attendant sat in a corner booth, hands curled around a chipped coffee mug. The TV bolted above the counter blared her story. A veteran administrator of the FAA was struck by a flight attendant during a heated exchange at the airport. The case has reignited debate about power dynamics, workplace respect, and the treatment of frontline workers. Was this a dangerous act of violence, or an act of defiance against systemic arrogance? Her face flushed as the cameras replayed her hand connecting with his cheek. The soundless loop felt like it would devour her. Across from her, her union representative leaned in. You need to know something. This isn't just about you anymore. People are calling, workers' groups, activists, even some politicians. They want to make this case a rallying point. She exhaled, a bitter laugh slipping out. I didn't ask for that. I just snapped. That's the point, the rep said. Everyone who's been pushed, silenced, or humiliated, they see themselves in you. Meanwhile, at FAA headquarters, the administrator held a press conference. Cameras flashed as he stepped to the podium, posture flawless, suit immaculate. Yesterday's proceedings, he began, voice sharp, were not about justice. They were about theatrics. I was assaulted, plain and simple. If the system excuses this, then authority becomes meaningless. We cannot govern aviation or anything by chaos and disrespect. Questions flew at him. Do you regret your words that provoked the incident? Do you believe the flight attendant represents a larger worker frustration? Is this about power, sir, or about dignity? He cut through with a dismissive smile. This is about standards. Without them, safety crumbles. Clips of his statements circulated within hours, spliced next to footage of protesters chanting outside the courthouse. The contrast was cinematic, his polished composure versus their raw anger. By midday, the storm had spiraled into every corner of American life. Talk radio debated it, morning shows framed it as a cultural litmus test. Social media split into factions. On Twitter, #protect workers trended alongside #no excuse for violence. A viral post showed a split screen, her slapping him, and historical images of civil disobedience with a caption, when respect is denied, resistance speaks. Others mocked her. Imagine trusting someone who loses control like that at 30,000 feet. In living rooms, arguments simmered between family members. At lunch breaks, co-workers whispered about whether they'd ever wanted to do the same to their boss. That evening, a cable network staged a televised debate. 4 panelists filled the screen: a labor organizer, a conservative commentator, a psychologist, and a former flight director. The labor organizer: this wasn't just a slap, it was a breaking point. Our workers are overextended, disrespected, and when someone finally pushes back, they're punished. The conservative: if you condone violence, you erode discipline, period. Imagine if every disagreement ended with someone hitting their superior. The psychologist: we need to look at the emotional toll of constant stress and dehumanization. People reach a threshold. This is what happens when leadership ignores humanity. The former flight director: I'll tell you this, much aviation safety depends on respect going both ways. That's not what happened here. The moderator closed with a chilling line. Tonight, the nation is watching one slap become a mirror. What do we see staring back at us? The flight attendant watched that debate alone in her apartment. Shadows pooled around her living room, the TV casting cold light across her face. Her phone buzzed, non-stop calls from reporters, messages from strangers, and, most hauntingly, texts from coworkers. You said what we all felt. I'm proud of you, but they're going to come for you. Stay strong, you're not alone. Tears stung her eyes. Not from regret, but from the unbearable weight of suddenly being turned into a symbol. She hadn't chosen this stage, but now she couldn't step off it. At the same time, the administrator sat in his office, blinds drawn, his aides shuffled papers, muttering about public relations strategies. A television flickered silently in the corner, showing clips of him being parodied on late-night comedy shows. His jaw tightened. They think this is funny, he muttered. One aide offered, Sir, public opinion shifts. Stay the course. You have the system on your side. But in his gut, the administrator felt something he hadn't in years: vulnerability. Not from the slap itself, but from the way it had cracked his armor, letting the country see him as a man, not a symbol of control. And in that humanity, his power seemed shakier than ever. By week's end, the storm had metastasized into congressional chatter. Senators referenced the case in committee hearings. Editorials called for reform. Activists organized marches at airports, chanting, "Dignity in the skies." The story no longer belonged to the courtroom, it belonged to the nation. Late one night, the flight attendant's phone rang. A voice on the other end introduced itself, calm, authoritative, careful. Ms. Daniels, this is Judge Carter, Federal Circuit. I've been following your case closely. She froze. Why are you calling me? Because what happens to you might decide more than your own career. It may decide how this system treats every worker beneath it. Her throat went dry. And what happens if I lose? The pause on the other end was long, heavy. Then the judge said, softly but firmly, then we will all have lost something far greater. The line went dead, and for the first time, she realized this storm was no longer just about her survival, it was about the survival of dignity itself. The headlines hadn't cooled when Washington took notice. By Monday morning, the slap was no longer just viral, it was political currency. Inside a hushed congressional office, staffers huddled around a long mahogany table, screens lit up with clips, graphs of polling data, and the endless scroll of hashtags. A senator paced, tapping his pen against his palm. This isn't about a slap anymore, he said. It's about whether people believe the system crushes workers or protects them. If we mishandle this, we lose the narrative, an aide muttered, and the administrator's arrogance doesn't help. Every time he opens his mouth, it plays like a parody of bureaucracy. The senator snapped back. Don't underestimate him. He's survived scandals before. His grip on FAA policy is ironclad. He's not just fighting a flight attendant, he's fighting for control of his legacy. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit union hall, the flight attendants sat among organizers and fellow workers. Posters lined the walls, old campaigns about wages, safety, dignity. The room buzzed with voices, everyone talking at once. One steward slammed his fist on the table. They suspended her to make an example. If we don't rally, they'll bury her career, and every worker's voice along with it. Another worker leaned forward, eyes sharp. The country is watching. For once, they're listening. We need to escalate. She raised her hand hesitantly, voice low. Escalate how? I'm already drowning. My face is plastered everywhere. I can't walk down the street without someone pointing. Silence fell. Then the union leader said, carefully, that's exactly why you're powerful now. You didn't ask for it, but you're the symbol, and symbols change history. Her stomach twisted. She hadn't wanted to lead a movement. She'd only wanted respect. Yet here she was, being pulled deeper into a fight that felt bigger than any one person. At FAA headquarters, the administrator convened his own private war room. The blinds were closed, and the mood was sharp as cut glass. A communications officer spoke first. Sir, public support is splintered. Half the country sees her as a folk hero. The other half thinks she's a reckless employee, unfit for her job. The administrator's jaw clenched. Half is enough. We just need discipline on our side. Judges, committees, regulators, they'll always value order over chaos. But the optics, forget optics, he cut in coldly. We don't govern by optics. We govern by rules. And if the rules bend to sentiment, the system collapses. His words echoed in the room, steely and unyielding. But beneath the surface, his hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie, till his aides pretended not to notice. That evening, two news anchors staged a split-screen interview. On one side, a fiery congresswoman calling for reform. On the other, a measured FAA spokesperson defending the administrator. The congresswoman's words struck like flint. What we saw wasn't just a slap, it was a collapse of trust. Workers aren't machines. If our institutions treat them like disposable tools, then who will keep the skies safe? The spokesperson's reply was icy. Order matters. A slap in the face of leadership is a slap in the face of public safety. Millions watched, hearts pulled in opposite directions, every phrase feeding the growing national fracture. Late that night, the flight attendant sat alone, scrolling through messages on her phone. One caught her breath, a voicemail from an unknown number. It was the administrator's voice, calm, precise, cutting. You've made your point. But this is bigger than you. Stop now, before you're destroyed. You will not win this. Her hands shook as she replayed it. It wasn't just a warning, it was a promise. She closed her eyes, hearing again the judge's words from days before. What happens to you may decide how this system treats every worker beneath it. The weight settled heavy on her chest. This was no longer about survival. It was about defiance against a machine that wanted her silence. Back in Washington, the senator scribbled notes for a hearing. His aide whispered, "Sir, are you sure you want to take this on?" The administrator has friends everywhere. Aviation boards, donors, lobbyists. The senator looked up, eyes tired but resolute. Friends don't matter when the public is watching. And right now, the public is watching more closely than ever. The aide exhaled, realizing what this meant. The storm was heading for Capitol Hill. The following morning, headlines broke. Congress announces emergency oversight hearing on FAA conduct. The flight attendant stared at the article on her cracked phone screen. Her name was in bold letters, tethered now to a fight she'd never chosen. Outside, protesters gathered, voices echoing through the streets. Justice for workers, accountability now. Inside her chest, fear and resolve warred. She whispered to herself, almost like a vow. They wanted silence. They're going to get a storm. The Capitol building gleamed beneath a pale winter sun. Inside, the air was charged, rows of cameras, reporters hunched over laptops, flashes bursting every few seconds. The hearing chamber looked less like a government proceeding and more like a stage, built for a nation's reckoning. At the front sat the committee of senators, at the witness table, the FAA administrator, immaculate in a dark suit, and across the aisle, the flight attendant, hands folded tightly in her lap, heart hammering so loud she thought the microphones would pick it up. The chair's gavel slammed down. Crack. The sound ricocheted through the chamber. This hearing will come to order. Today we examine not just an altercation, but the culture of power and accountability inside our federal institutions. Let us be clear, this is about more than one incident. It is about whether those who enforce rules believe they are above them. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The first senator leaned forward, voice sharp. Administrator, let me start plainly. Do you believe calling a frontline worker insignificant reflects the values of your agency? The administrator's jaw flexed. He kept his tone measured. I do not recall using that word, and if I did, it would have been in a specific context to reminding staff of hierarchy necessary for aviation safety. Gasps and mutters followed. The senator shot back. Hierarchy doesn't excuse humiliation. The administrator's smile tightened. Respect cuts both ways. Without order, planes fall from the sky. Next came the questioning of the flight attendant. Her palms sweated as she leaned toward the microphone. Ms. Daniels, a senator said gently, tell us what you felt in that moment. Her throat constricted. For a second, she almost stayed silent, but the memory of his words, sharp, dismissive, crushing, pushed her voice forward. I felt invisible, she said, steadying herself. Like no matter how hard I worked, no matter what I gave, I was nothing to him, nothing to the system he represents. And in that second, I broke. The room stilled. Even the clicking cameras fell silent. The administrator leaned forward, eyes narrow. She struck me. That's the only fact that matters. In any other workplace, that would be immediate termination. No questions asked. Her head snapped toward him, voice rising. And in any other workplace, a supervisor who belittled someone the way you did would face consequences too. But you never have. Not once. A sharp gavel bang. Order in the chamber. But the exchange had already landed raw, unscripted, undeniable. The union representative was called next, offering testimony about systemic treatment. Our members report constant disrespect, burnout, a culture that demands silence. The administrator's words weren't a one-off, they're symptomatic. One senator cut in. Are you saying this was predictable? Yes, the rep said firmly. When workers are treated as replaceable parts long enough, pressure explodes. The administrator adjusted his microphone, voice colder now. This entire spectacle undermines discipline. If every grievance becomes a national crisis, we cannot function. I will not apologize for defending standards. A congresswoman shot back, voice sharp as glass. Standards or control? Because what I see is a man confusing his authority with digniton, using the system to shield himself from accountability. Applause broke out from the public gallery before the gavel pounded it down. The hearing dragged into hours. Senators volleyed, staff whispered notes, cameras captured every flicker of expression. The narrative sharpened. One side portraying a disciplined leader, protecting order, the other exposing a bureaucrat, cloaked in arrogance. At one point, a senator revealed internal FAA memo staff complaints, ignored warnings about toxic management. The administrator's face drained as the papers were read aloud. Administrator, the senator said slowly, these documents show a pattern. Repeated dismissals of frontline concerns, repeated instances of belittling staff. How do you explain this? The administrator shifted. For the first time, visibly rattled. Disgruntled voices exist in any large organization. The senator cut him off. Disgruntled or desperate. The tension was suffocating. The cameras leaned in. Through it all, the flight attendant sat silent, her hands trembling beneath the table. She had spoken her truth, but now she watched the machinery of politics grind it into spectacle. Her story was no longer hers, was fuel, ammunition, narrative. Yet, As she looked across the chamber at the administrator, she saw it, a crack in his armor. Not in his words, which stayed polished, but in his eyes tight, weary, cornered. For the first time, she believed he might actually fall. The gavel came down again. This hearing is adjourned. But make no mistake, this committee will pursue this matter further. The public deserves accountability. Reporters surged forward, shouting questions. Cameras swarmed the hallway. Protesters outside roared chants that shook the marble floors. The administrator pushed through with his entourage, jaw locked, refusing to acknowledge the cameras. The flight attendant emerged separately, lights flashing in her face, microphones shoved toward her. "Do you regret what you did?" one reporter yelled. She stopped, met the camera lens, and said clearly, "I regret that it had to come to this, but I do not regret standing up." The crowd erupted. Back inside, the empty chamber echoed with what had been said and what could not be unsaid. The stage was set, and somewhere, deep in the quiet corners of the FA, aides whispered the unthinkable. Maybe his reign was ending. The morning after the hearing, newspapers across the country carried the same photo. The administrator caught mid-blink, jaw tight, while the flight attendant's words, "I do not regret standing up," were printed in bold beneath his image. The caption might as well have been a verdict. Inside FAA headquarters, the tension was palpable. Staffers whispered in hallways, eyes darting when he passed. Aides clutched folders tighter, hesitant to meet his gaze. The administrator, usually a figure of unshakable control, now seemed surrounded by silence that had weight. "Sir," one advisor began in his office, "we have a problem. Leaks. Someone's been feeding memos to the press. The complaints you dismissed, they're everywhere now." The administrator's voice snapped like a whip. "Find the leak. Shut it down." The aide shifted uncomfortably. "With respect, sir, this isn't one leak. It's a flood. People are talking. Workers are finally unafraid." The administrator's face hardened. "Afraid is what kept this agency running." For the first time, the aide didn't nod. Across town, the flight attendant sat at her kitchen table, staring at the stack of unopened mail, bills, letters from strangers, media requests, it all blurred together. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she replayed the hearing, the gavel slamming, the administrator's cold glare. Her phone buzzed. It was her union rep. "They're cracking. The press has internal documents, emails, reports. It's bad for him. Real bad." She pressed the phone harder to her ear. "And me? What happens to me in all this?" A pause. "Then, you've become untouchable, in a way, but also more vulnerable. They'll dig into your past. They'll smear you if they can." She closed her eyes. The victory felt like sand slipping through her hands. That evening, cable news panels dissected every angle. One commentator leaned toward the camera. "This isn't about one man's arrogance, it's about an institution designed to silence. The administrator is simply the face we can finally pin it on." Another fired back. "Let's not rewrite reality. A worker assaulted her superior. You can't excuse violence because you dislike authority." The split-screen image of the two voices shouting at each other mirrored the divide playing out in living rooms across America. Inside a dim bar in D.C., two FAA officials sat nursing drinks, voices low. "You hear, committees drafting they want an independent oversight board." The other whistled. "That'll gut his power." The first one shrugged. "He built this empire on fear. Fear doesn't last when the world's watching." They clinked glasses, almost like they were toasting the end of an era. Meanwhile, the administrator sat in his penthouse apartment, city lights sprawling beneath him. A television flickered, replaying his stumbles from the hearing. Late-night comedians mocked his phrases. Editorials called for his resignation. He shut the TV off, silence swallowing the room. For a long time, he just sat there, staring at his reflection in the window, an old man in a sharp suit, clinging to relevance, to control, to dignity that was slipping away. His phone buzzed. A senator's aide. The message was blunt. "Your allies can't hold this line much longer. Step aside, or they'll make you." For the first time in years, the administrator felt something foreign. Fear. The flight attendant, meanwhile, walked into her workplace for the first time since her suspension. Every head turned. Some coworkers embraced her. Others looked away, afraid of being seen siding with her. In the break room, a young attendant whispered, "You changed everything. Even if they bury you, you already won." Her throat tightened. She wanted to believe it, but the truth pressed heavy. She was still just one woman, and tomorrow, The world could forget her just as quickly as it had raised her up by week's end. The headlines screamed, FAA Administrator under fire as leaks reveal pattern of abuse. Union leaders call for resignation. Oversight hearing expands to institutional reform. The administrator called an emergency staff meeting. He stood at the front of the room, trying to project strength. They think they can destroy me, he said. They forget who holds this agency together. No one responded. The silence was suffocating. Eyes avoided his. It was the silence of abandonment. He slammed his hand on the podium. You need me. Without me, this place falls apart. But as he scanned the faces before him, he knew it was over. Loyalty had evaporated that night. As protests filled the streets outside FAA headquarters, workers chanting, candles lit, signs raised. The flight attendant walked past the crowd. Some recognized her, chanting her name. She smiled faintly, but it felt hollow. She wasn't sure if she was free, or just trapped in a different cage, one built of expectation, of symbolism, of a fight she never chose. Still, as she watched the chants rise into the night, one truth settled in her chest. The cracks in his armor were no longer small, they were widening, and soon, the whole thing would shatter. The hearing room was packed again, this time, far beyond capacity. Reporters filled the aisles, cameras crowded the back wall, cords snaking under desks. Protesters outside chanted loud enough that their voices seeped through the marble. Everyone knew. This wasn't just another oversight session. This was the day that the administrator walked in flanked by aides, but there was no applause, no respectful hush, only the click-click of cameras and the low murmur of contempt. His tie was too tight, his skin pale under the fluorescent lights. For the first time, he looked like a man on trial instead of one presiding over it. The chairwoman of the committee leaned into her mic. Her voice was calm but sharp as glass. Administrator, this body has received internal communications. Do you deny dismissing safety complaints from workers and retaliating against those who raised concerns? The administrator's jaw worked. I deny the characterization. Strong leadership requires. She cut him off. Leadership does not mean intimidation. It does not mean silencing the very people tasked with keeping our skies safe. Murmurs rippled through the room. From the back, the flight attendant watched, heart pounding. She wasn't at the table this time today, wasn't her fight to lead. But she knew every word spoken here was born from the moment she'd refused to bow. A staffer rolled in a cart stacked with binders. They thudded against the witness table. Inside, copies of emails, whistleblower reports, disciplinary files. The paper trail was undeniable. Would you care to explain? The chairwoman asked why multiple safety concerns were labeled insubordination in your handwriting. The administrator swallowed. Because those individuals sought to undermine authority. Without discipline, an agency cannot function. Gasps. Laughter from some in the crowd. The words landed like nails in his coffin. One senator leaned forward. So, in your own words, safety took a backseat to your pride. The administrator froze. His silence was an admission. Outside, cameras flashed as breaking news banners scrolled across screens. Nationwide, FAA administrator cornered. Evidence mounts of abuse, retaliation. Cable anchors cut into regular programming, narrating every glare, every stumble. For once, the spectacle wasn't controlled by him. The flight attendant left the room mid. She couldn't sit there watching his collapse like a spectator at a hanging. Instead, she walked the corridors, pausing at a window overlooking the sea of protesters outside. Handmade signs bobbed in the air. Justice for workers. Safety over silence. She spoke. We stand. She pressed her hand against the glass. For the first time since the slap, she let herself breathe. Maybe this wasn't about her anymore. Maybe it never was. Inside, the climax unfolded. A senator read the final recommendation aloud. Effective immediately. This committee moves to strip the administrator of his authority pending full investigation. Furthermore, we urge the president to request his resignation in the interest of public trust. The words hung heavy. Cameras zoomed in on his face. His lips parted, as though he might object, but no sound came out. His power, once unquestionable, evaporated in a single vote. Flashbulbs popped. Reporters shouted questions. Do you plan to resign? Do you regret your actions? Was intimidation your only leadership strategy? He stood, trembling. For a brief second, his eyes flicked to the back of the room, where the flight attendant had sat earlier. He looked for her, but she was gone. That night, networks replayed his downfall on loop. A man once untouchable, now reduced to sound bites of shame. Late-night shows tore him apart. Editorials eulogized his career as an empire built on silence, toppled by one voice. In his apartment, the administrator sat in the dark, tie discarded on the floor. The city buzzed outside, indifferent. His phone lit with missed calls. Senators, aides, his own attorneys. He didn't answer. On the coffee table sat tomorrow's headline, already leaked online. Administrator resigns in disgrace. The flight attendant, meanwhile, sat in her small living room, lights off, blinds drawn. She held a mug of tea in her hands, steam curling upward. Her phone buzzed non-stop messages of thanks, solidarity, invitations to speak at rallies. She ignored most of them. She wasn't sure she wanted to become a symbol, but then she opened one email. It was from a young attendant in training, just 21 years old. Because of you, I believe I can survive in this job. Thank you for showing us we don't have to stay silent. Her eyes stung. She set the mug down, leaning back into the quiet. For the first time, the silence didn't feel like exile. It felt like peace. Across the city, the administrator finally turned on his television. The headline confirmed what he already knew. It was over. His empire was gone, dismantled piece by piece. But there was no catharsis, no lesson learned, only emptiness. He whispered into the empty room, as though someone might hear. I was the backbone. Without me, they'll collapse. No one answered. Outside, the protests turned into celebrations. Candles replaced chants. Workers embraced each other. Strangers united by something larger than themselves. The story of a slap had become the story of a system broken and finally cracking open. And above it all, the city lights glowed, indifferent, eternal, outlasting men, outlasting power, outlasting even the most stubborn grip on control. The administrator had fallen, the worker had risen, and the balance of silence and voice had shifted, if only for a moment, toward justice. The courthouse steps were empty now, where thousands had gathered only days before. There remained only scattered leaflets, a few broken signs, and the echo of chants that had rattled the marble walls. The administrator's name no longer carried weight. It was a headline yesterday, a cautionary tale today. And by tomorrow, it would dissolve into the vast churn of scandal and politics. His resignation was already archived on government websites, a brief announcement stripped of drama, stripped of humanity. But the flight attendant still carried the weight. She returned to work 2 weeks later. The first day back, she walked down the narrow jet bridge, uniform pressed, wings pinned to her chest. Every detail felt charged, the scent of recirculated air, the dull hum of turbines, the way passengers glanced at her and then looked away. Some smiled, some whispered. A middle-aged woman reached out as she passed. You were brave, she said softly. The flight attendant nodded, but words failed her. Brave. That wasn't how it had felt. It had felt like drowning in public, mid-flight, as she secured the cabin. Her phone buzzed in her pocket with a notification she wasn't supposed to check on duty. At 35,000 feet, she peeked anyway. A headline. Again. Former FAA administrator under federal investigation for retaliation and misuse of authority. She shut the phone quickly, tucked it back. It was over for him. Yes, but somehow, knowing the system was finally turning its eyes toward him didn't ease the knot in her chest. Justice never came clean. It came layered in exhaustion, grief, and scars that no headline erased. That evening, she walked home from the train station. The city air was thick with late summer heat. Neon lights reflected in puddles along cracked sidewalks. She paused outside a bar, where the news played on a muted TV. Inside, a crowd laughed at a late-night monologue, mocking the administrator's downfall. She turned away. She couldn't join the laughter. For her, this wasn't comedy. It was memory. Weeks passed. She spoke at one rally, just one. A community hall filled with workers, teachers, postal clerks, nurses, people who had been silenced. She stood at the microphone, voice shaking, and said, I didn't want to be here. I didn't want to fight. I just wanted to do my job. But silence is a kind of violence too, and I couldn't live with it anymore. The applause was thunderous. Strangers stood and wept. Yet as she stepped down, she thought, they don't know the cost. One night, she sat on her balcony, city skylines sprawling in the distance. A call came in from her mother. They spoke briefly, weather, groceries, the latest family gossip. Just before hanging up, her mother whispered, I'm proud of you. She bit her lip hard, because she didn't feel proud. She felt tired. But maybe that was the truth of it. Victories didn't come wrapped in pride. They came in survival. Across town, the administrator lived in obscurity. His penthouse was stripped of staff. His calendar was blank. He rarely left the building, except for meetings with attorneys. At night, he scrolled endlessly through articles about himself. Some called him corrupt, others pathetic. A few defended him still, clinging to the idea of order. But the world had moved on. The phone no longer rang with invitations to panels, interviews, or conferences. His empire had crumbled without ceremony. He stared at the city through tinted glass. The skyline pulsed with light, alive, unconcerned. For the first time, he understood how small he was. Months later, the flight attendant walked through an airport concourse. She carried no sign, no headline. Followed her now, just another worker, blending into the tide of travelers. But as she passed a bookstore kiosk, she froze. On a glossy cover, her own face stared back at her. Someone had written a book about the scandal. Her name, in bold letters, packaged, sold. She stood there, for a long time, passengers brushing past her, until she finally turned away. She hadn't asked to be she had only asked to be heard. That night, lying in bed, she closed her eyes and remembered the slap, the sting, the humiliation, the sound of laughter that had cut through her like glass. She remembered the silence after. She remembered how alone she had felt. And she realized that moment would never vanish. It would live with her, stitched into her skin, but it would not define her. Slowly, she exhaled. Outside, the city kept moving. Planes roared overhead. News cycles churned. Empires rose and fell. And, in the quiet of her room, one woman carried forward, not unscarred, not triumphant, but alive, awake, unwilling, ever again to be silenced.